The sky bled crimson over the jagged horizon as Samuel Blackwood's silhouette cut a lonely figure against the setting sun. His hand resting on the weathered grip of his Colt revolver, a habit born not of anticipation, but of a life where trust came at too high a price. Samuel had spent nearly 12 years riding alone through the Western Territories. His name whispered with a mixture of respect and fear from Montana to the Texas border. At 34, the lines etching his sun-weathered face told stories of hardship, survival, and a solitude so complete it had calcified around his heart like the mineral deposits that line the desert caves he sometimes sheltered in. The year was 1876, and the promise of America's western frontier was beginning to fade like an old tintype photograph. The railroads were pushing further west, bringing with them the civilization Samuel had spent a lifetime avoiding. He'd seen too much death, too much betrayal, first as a Union soldier too young to properly grow a beard, then as a reluctant gunslinger who'd made his reputation defending a mining camp from raiders, and finally as a bounty hunter who tracked men through terrain that would kill most before hunger, thirst, or a bullet had the chance. It was in this capacity that Samuel found himself riding into the small settlement of Cottonwood Springs, Wyoming territory, as the October winds carried the first bite of the coming winter. The town had sprung up around a natural spring that fed a small creek lined with the cottonwood trees that gave the settlement its name. A single main street stretched no more than 400 yards, with wooden buildings weathered gray by sun and wind flanking either side. Samuel's dun stallion, reckoning, picked his way carefully down the rutted main street. The horse was like his master, lean, wary, and disinclined to trust. As they passed the general store, Samuel noted the usual curious stares from the townsfolk. He kept his gaze forward, the brim of his black hat pulled low. "Blackwood," a voice called out, and Samuel reined in his horse with the barest movement of his wrist. Sheriff Willard Tate stood in front of the jailhouse, his graying mustache and weathered face a testament to years spent keeping the peace in a land where peace was as scarce as water. "Sheriff," Samuel acknowledged with a slight nod. "Your telegram found me." "Didn't expect you'd come yourself," Tate replied, his eyes taking in the dust of the trail that coated Samuel's long canvas duster. "Figured you'd send one of your men." "Don't have men," Samuel replied flatly. "What's this job worth to you?" The sheriff sighed, glancing up and down the street before gesturing Samuel to dismount. $500. Town council scraped it together. After what happened to the Miller family, folks are scared. Samuel swung down from his saddle, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. $500 was a substantial sum, enough to keep him in supplies and ammunition for a good long while. "Tell me about it." Sheriff Tate led him into the jailhouse, a simple structure with 2 cells in the back and a desk littered with wanted posters and paperwork. Been a string of raids on outlying homesteads, 3 in the last month. Last one, they killed John Miller, his oldest boy too, took their livestock, burned the barn. "Indians?" Samuel asked, though he doubted it. The native raids had largely ceased in this region. "No," Tate shook his head. "White men, organized, 6, maybe 7 of them, led by a fella named Decker, Ezra Decker." Samuel's expression remained impassive, but a cold fury kindled in his chest. He knew Decker. The man had ridden with a gang out of Colorado territory 2 years back. Samuel had tracked them after they'd murdered a family near Denver. He'd brought in 4 of them, but Decker had escaped. "I'll need supplies," Samuel said, "and information, anything you know about where they might be holed up." "Got a room for you at the boarding house," Tate replied. "Owner's a widow, Mrs. Preston. She can feed you proper. As for Decker's whereabouts, rumor has it they're using an abandoned mine in the foothills, about 20 miles northwest." Samuel nodded. "I'll head out at first light." The sheriff handed him a folded paper. "This authorizes you to act as deputy in this matter. Town's got no appetite for a trial, just want the threat removed." Samuel tucked the paper into his coat without looking at it. Authorization meant nothing to him. He operated by his own code, one forged in blood and tempered by years of solitude. The law was a convenience for those who could afford it. One more thing, Tate added as Samuel turned to leave. Mrs. Preston's niece is visiting from back east, arrived on yesterday's stage. She's not accustomed to our ways out here. I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your business private. Samuel merely nodded and stepped back into the fading light. The idea of sharing accommodations with Eastern visitors held no appeal, but he'd slept in worse places than a boarding house with too many occupants. After stabling reckoning and retrieving his saddlebags, Samuel made his way to the 2-story clapboard structure at the edge of town. A hand-painted sign reading Preston Boarding House hung from the porch eave. The building was well-maintained, with curtains in the windows and a small garden plot to one side, signs of a woman's touch that Samuel had long ago stopped noticing or caring about. He knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping against the wood with practiced restraint. Footsteps approached from within, light and quick, before the door swung open to reveal a young woman whose appearance momentarily caught Samuel off guard. She was not what he expected in this frontier town, tall and straight-backed, with dark auburn hair pulled into a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Her dress was of good quality but practical, a deep blue that complemented the startling clarity of her green eyes. Those eyes now widened slightly as they took in Samuel's imposing figure. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the refined cadence of the eastern seaboard, but lacking the affected fragility Samuel had come to associate with city women. "Samuel Blackwood," he said simply. Sheriff arranged lodging. A flash of recognition crossed her features. "Yes, of course. I'm Penelope Warren, Aunt Martha's niece. Please come in. She's just seeing to dinner." Samuel stepped inside, automatically cataloging exits, windows, and potential defensive positions habits formed from years of expecting trouble to find him. The interior was modest but clean, with a parlor to the right and a dining room visible beyond. The smell of cooking food reminded him he hadn't eaten since dawn. "Mr. Blackwood," an older woman's voice called as she emerged from what must have been the kitchen. Martha Preston was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had faced the Western elements for many years. "Sheriff Tate mentioned you'd be staying with us. I've prepared the room at the end of the hall upstairs. It's small but private." "Madam," Samuel acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat. "Appreciate it. Dinner will be served shortly," Mrs. Preston continued. "You have time to wash up if you'd like. Penelope can show you to your room." The younger woman nodded and gestured toward the stairs. "This way, Mr. Blackwood." Samuel followed her up the narrow staircase, acutely aware of the clean scent of lavender that seemed to surround her. It had been a long time since he'd noticed such things about a woman. "You're from back east," he stated, rather than asked as they reached the landing. Penelope glanced back at him with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Philadelphia. I arrived yesterday. Long way from home." "Yes," she agreed, pausing before a door at the end of the hall. "This is your room. There's water in the pitcher for washing. Dinner is in 20 minutes. Samuel nodded his thanks, and she turned to leave before pausing. "Mr. Blackwood," she said hesitantly, "the sheriff mentioned you're here on business." "That's right." Her green eyes studied him with an intensity that few people dared show when facing him. "Is it dangerous business?" "Usually is," he replied honestly. Something about her direct gaze made lying seem pointless. She nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "Then I hope you'll be careful. We've had enough tragedy in Cottonwood Springs recently." Before Samuel could respond, she was gone, leaving him with the unexpected and unwelcome sensation that Penelope Warren saw more in him than the hardened bounty hunter most people feared. It was a feeling he would need to ignore if he was to focus on the task at hand. Samuel washed the dust of the trail from his face and hands, the cold water a welcome shock to his system. As he did, he tried to push thoughts of Penelope Warren from his mind. Women like her educated, refined, clearly from money had no place in his world. More importantly, he had no place in theirs. After the death of his wife Marie 12 years earlier, murdered by raiders while he was away fighting in the war, Samuel had locked away any capacity for tenderness. When he returned to find his home burned and his young wife buried in a shallow grave, something fundamental had broken inside him. He tracked the men responsible deserters from the Confederate Army and killed them all. The violence had satisfied nothing, but it had set him on a path he'd followed ever since. Dinner at the Preston boarding house was a quiet affair. Besides Samuel, Mrs. Preston, and Penelope, there were only two other boarders, a traveling salesman named Hobson who sold agricultural equipment, and an elderly gentleman, Mr. Finch, who had once been a schoolteacher and now spent his days reading and writing letters to family back in Vermont. Samuel ate methodically, focusing on the surprisingly good food rather than the occasional glance Penelope cast in his direction. Mrs. Preston had prepared a hearty beef stew with fresh biscuits, a welcome change from the jerky and hardtack that constituted Samuel's usual fare on the trail. Mr. Blackwood, Hobson ventured, clearly the type who couldn't abide silence, what brings you to our little settlement? You don't strike me as a man interested in modern farming implements. He chuckled at his own joke. Just passing through, Samuel replied, not looking up from his plate. Mr. Blackwood is helping Sheriff Tate with some business, Mrs. Preston interjected smoothly. Now, Mr. Hobson, you were telling us about that new threshing machine before dinner. The conversation shifted, much to Samuel's relief. As the meal concluded, he excused himself to the porch, where the cool evening air cleared his head. He needed to review what he knew about Decker and plan his approach to the abandoned mine. The soft creak of the door announced someone joining him. From the light footsteps, he knew it was Penelope before he turned to look. "Do you mind company, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. He should say yes, he minded very much. Instead, he found himself shaking his head and shifting slightly to make room for her at the porch railing. "You don't seem the type to seek out conversation," she observed, her voice carrying no judgment. "I'm not," he confirmed. She smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her face from merely beautiful to something that made Samuel's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Then we needn't talk," she said, turning to look out at the darkened street. "I find I've had quite enough conversation for one day myself." Philadelphia drawing rooms are full of people talking endlessly while saying absolutely nothing of substance. Despite himself, Samuel felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "That why you came west? Looking for substance?" Penelope considered this for a moment. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I was simply running away." "From what?" She glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight from inside. "From expectations. From a life plotted out by others without my consultation. From a man who saw me as a suitable acquisition rather than a person." Samuel found himself unexpectedly intrigued. Most people head west looking for something, not running away. "And you, Mr. Blackwood, what were you looking for when you came west?" The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him that in years, perhaps because the hard lines of his face discouraged such personal inquiries. "Started out looking for justice," he said finally. "Now I just do what needs doing." Penelope studied him with those perceptive green eyes. "And tomorrow?" "What needs doing tomorrow that has my aunt worried and the sheriff looking relieved you've arrived?" Samuel considered deflecting the question but found himself answering honestly. "There's a gang been raiding homesteads, killing folks, taking what they want. Sheriffs hired me to stop them." "Stop them," she repeated softly. "You mean kill them?" It wasn't a question, and Samuel didn't treat it as one. Men like that don't stop any other way. To his surprise, Penelope didn't flinch or retreat in horror as many Eastern women might have. Instead, she nodded slowly. "The Miller family." I heard about them this morning. Mrs. Miller and her daughters have taken refuge with Reverend Holloway's family. You disapprove? Samuel asked, curious about her response. Of protecting people who can't protect themselves. She shook her head. No, I don't disapprove of that. I just wonder about the cost to the protector. Their eyes met. And for a moment, Samuel felt as if she could see straight through the hardened exterior to the wounded man beneath the one he'd buried alongside Marie all those years ago. It was disconcerting, and he broke the contact first, looking back out at the darkened street. Cost doesn't matter, he said gruffly. Job needs doing. Penelope was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. My father was a doctor in Philadelphia. He believed that every life had value, that healing was always preferable to harming. But during the war, he volunteered as a field surgeon. He came back changed. She paused. He said sometimes cutting away diseased flesh was the only way to save the patient. Samuel glanced at her, surprised by the analogy. I should let you rest, she said suddenly, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. You have an early start tomorrow, I imagine. Dawn, he confirmed. Penelope nodded and moved toward the door before pausing. Be careful, Mr. Blackwood. Cottonwood Springs needs men like you, even if they don't always admit it. Before he could respond, she had slipped back inside, leaving Samuel with the unsettling feeling that Penelope Warren had somehow managed to see parts of him he'd thought long hidden from the world. More disturbing still was the realization that he didn't entirely mind. Morning came with the first gray light filtering through the small window of Samuel's room. He rose silently, dressed, and checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. The Colt revolver at his hip had been with him since the war, its ivory grip worn smooth by years of use. The Winchester rifle he'd acquired later, valuing its accuracy and reliability in the unforgiving terrain of the West. He was surprised to find a lamp lit in the kitchen and Penelope already awake, wrapping biscuits and strips of bacon in a cloth. I thought you might want something to take with you, she explained, not looking up from her task. She wore a simple dress of brown cotton, her hair braided and draped over one shoulder. Wasn't expecting anyone to be up, Samuel said, watching her efficient movements. I'm an early riser, she replied, finally meeting his gaze. Always have been. It used to drive my mother to distraction. A lady should never be seen before she's properly prepared for the day. There was a hint of amused rebellion in her voice that made Samuel curious about what had shaped this woman who seemed at once both proper and defiant of propriety. Thank you, he said, accepting the package she handed him. Their fingers brushed momentarily, and Samuel was acutely aware of the contrast her smooth skin against his calloused hand. There's coffee, too, she added, pouring a steaming cup from a pot on the stove. It's strong. Aunt Martha always says coffee should stand up on its own, or it's not worth drinking. Samuel accepted the cup, sipping the black liquid appreciatively. Your aunt's right about that. A comfortable silence fell between them as he drank his coffee and Penelope busied herself with tidying the kitchen. There was something oddly domestic about the scene, something that stirred memories Samuel had long suppressed. How long will you be gone? She asked finally, her back to him as she wiped down the stove top. Depends, he answered truthfully. Could be back by nightfall, could be longer. She nodded, still not turning. If you're not back in 3 days, should someone come looking for you? The question surprised him. Few people would concern themselves with his welfare. No, if I'm not back in 3 days, there wouldn't be much point. Now she did turn, her expression troubled. That's a rather bleak assessment, Mr. Blackwood, Samuel shrugged. It's honest, I work alone for a reason. Don't need anyone else getting hurt on my account. And who worries about you getting hurt? She asked softly. The question hung in the air between them, unexpected and unanswerable. No one had worried about Samuel Blackwood in 12 years, not since he'd buried his heart alongside Marie. I should get moving, he said, avoiding the question. Thank you for the food. Penelope nodded, her eyes still searching his face as if looking for something she couldn't quite find. "Godspeed, Mr. Blackwood." Samuel tipped his hat slightly and headed for the door, feeling her gaze on his back as he stepped out into the pre-dawn light. The interaction had left him unsettled in a way he couldn't quite define. Penelope Warren was becoming a distraction, and distractions in his line of work could be fatal. He collected reckoning from the livery stable, where the sleepy stable boy had prepared the horse as instructed the night before. The dun stallion nickered softly in recognition as Samuel approached, the only creature on earth that might be said to know him well. "Let's ride," Samuel murmured, swinging into the saddle and guiding the horse toward the northwest edge of town. The abandoned mine lay in the foothills, some 20 miles from Cottonwood Springs, a distance Samuel could cover in a few hours at a steady pace. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as he rode, the flat grasslands giving way to rocky slopes dotted with scrub, pine, and juniper. He followed game trails where possible, keeping to natural routes that would mask his approach. By mid-morning, Samuel had reached a vantage point that allowed him to survey the mine entrance from a distance. He dismounted and secured reckoning in a small grove of trees, ensuring the horse had access to water from a tiny spring seeping from the rocks. Through his field glass, Samuel observed the mine site carefully. Signs of occupation were evident: fresh horse droppings, a thin wisp of smoke rising from what must be a concealed fire inside the mine shaft, and most tellingly, a sentry positioned on a rocky outcrop above the entrance. The man was barely visible, but the occasional glint of sunlight on metal betrayed his position. Samuel settled in to watch, his patience honed by years of tracking prey, both human and animal. Over the next few hours, he observed 2 men emerge from the mine to relieve themselves, another leading horses to a small creek for water. And finally, as the sun began its westward descent, Ezra Decker himself stepping out to scan the horizon. Even at this distance, Samuel recognized him immediately. Decker was a big man with a shock of red hair and a distinctive limp from an old bullet wound. He had been a sergeant in the Confederate cavalry before turning to outlawry, and he carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. Samuel counted 6 men, including Decker, 1 short of Sheriff Tate's estimate, but enough to have carried out the deadly raids. They were well armed, each carrying revolvers, and Samuel spotted at least 3 rifles among them. A frontal assault would be suicide. Samuel would need to be more strategic. He continued his observation until dusk, noting the changing of the sentry and the patterns of movement. As darkness fell, he retreated to where reckoning waited patiently, considering his options. He could wait until deep night and attempt to infiltrate the camp, perhaps eliminate the men one by one as they slept. But mines had limited entry points, and the narrow passages would make it difficult to move silently. If he was discovered, the confined space would become a death trap. Another approach would be to set up an ambush along the trail they would likely take to their next raid. But that would require knowing their plans in advance, and it risked allowing them to attack another homestead before he could intercept them. As Samuel ate some of the food Penelope had prepared, he found his thoughts drifting to her more frequently than he liked. The way she had looked at him in the kitchen that morning, concerned about his welfare when she barely knew him. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at Samuel Blackwood and seen a man worth worrying about. He pushed the thoughts aside. Such distractions had no place in his current situation. He needed to focus on the task at hand, eliminating Decker and his gang before they could harm anyone else. By the time the moon rose, Samuel had formulated his plan. It was risky, but it played to his strengths: patience, marksmanship, and a willingness to do what others could not. He would wait until morning, when the gang would likely send men out to hunt for fresh meat or scout for their next target. He would pick them off one by one, whittling down their numbers before confronting Decker directly. With the plan set, Samuel allowed himself a few hours of the light sleep that years on the trail had trained him to use rest without vulnerability. Consciousness never fully surrendered. His last thought before this partial sleep claimed him was of green eyes that somehow saw through the layers of dust and blood that had accumulated on his soul over the years. Morning dawned clear and cold, with a light frost coating the grass and rocks around Samuel's position. He had moved before first light, positioning himself on a rocky outcrop with good sightlines to the mine entrance and the likely paths the gang members would take when leaving. His patience was rewarded when, shortly after sunrise, two men emerged from the mine and headed toward the creek, rifles slung over their shoulders. They moved with the casual confidence of men who believed themselves unobserved, talking loudly enough that snippets of their conversation carried to Samuel's position. "Should hit the Jenkins place next," one was saying. "Got a good herd of cattle, and word is he keeps his money under a floorboard in the bedroom." "Decker wants to wait another day," the other replied. "Let things quiet down after the Miller job." Samuel's jaw tightened at the callous way they discussed the attack that had left a man and his son dead. He raised his Winchester, sighting carefully on the first man. At this range, about 200 yards, the shot was challenging, but well within his capabilities. He exhaled slowly, then squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the first man dropped without a sound. Before the second could do more than turn in shock, Samuel had worked the lever action and fired again. The second outlaw fell beside his companion. Samuel immediately shifted position, moving quickly along the ridge to a secondary vantage point he'd identified earlier. The shots would have alerted the others, and he needed to be ready for their response. It came within minutes. 3 men burst from the mine entrance, weapons drawn, scanning the surrounding terrain. The sentry on the rocks above was gesturing urgently toward the creek, having spotted his fallen comrades. Samuel picked out Decker immediately. The red-haired man was issuing orders, sending one man to check on the fallen outlaws while he and another provided covering fire, shooting blindly toward the ridgeline. Samuel waited, letting them waste ammunition firing at shadows. When the man reached the bodies by the creek, Samuel took his shot. The outlaw crumpled, and new panic erupted among the remaining men. Decker was no fool. He quickly realized they were exposed and retreated into the mine entrance, dragging his companion with him. Samuel cursed under his breath. The situation had now evolved into exactly what he'd hoped to avoid a siege with the outlaws holed up in the mine. He settled in to wait. Decker and his remaining men, only 2 now, by Samuel's count, were trapped, but they had cover, likely supplies, and possibly another exit Samuel wasn't aware of. This standoff could last hours or even days. As noon approached, movement at the mine entrance caught Samuel's attention. A white cloth tied to a stick waved from the opening. "Blackwood," Decker's voice echoed across the distance. "I know it's you. No one else shoots like that." Samuel remained silent, watching carefully for any trick. "We can make a deal," Decker continued. "I've got money, lots of it, more than whatever bounty you're after." Still, Samuel didn't respond. Negotiating with men like Decker was pointless. They said whatever they thought would save their skins, then put a bullet in your back at the first opportunity. The standoff continued through the afternoon. Samuel maintained his vigilance, changing positions periodically to prevent Decker from pinpointing his location. As the sun began to set, he knew he needed to force a resolution before darkness gave the outlaws an advantage. The solution came in an unexpected form. As Samuel scanned the area through his field glass, he noticed a wagon approaching along the trail from the direction of Cottonwood Springs. He focused the glass and felt his blood run cold. Penelope Warren sat on the wagon seat, handling the reins with surprising competence. Beside her was Sheriff Tate, his rifle across his knees. Samuel cursed vehemently. What was she doing here? And why had Tate allowed it? They were riding directly into danger, and if Decker spotted them first, they would be easy targets. He had to act quickly. Samuel fired 3 rapid shots into the air, a universal signal of warning in the west. The wagon halted immediately, and he saw Tate scanning the ridgeline, raising a hand in acknowledgement when he spotted Samuel's position, but the shots had also alerted Decker. Samuel saw movement at the mine entrance, then the flash of a rifle barrel emerging. Without hesitation, Samuel fired, his bullet striking the wooden support beam near the mine entrance. He worked the lever action rapidly, firing again and again at the entrance, forcing Decker and his men to retreat deeper inside. Using the distraction, Tate had moved the wagon behind a large boulder, providing some cover. Samuel needed to reach them before Decker could regroup. He descended the ridge quickly, using the boulders and scrub for cover, making his way toward the wagon. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded as he reached them, directing his fury at Tate rather than Penelope. "Miss Warren insisted," Tate said defensively. "Said she had information you needed to know." Samuel turned to Penelope, who met his gaze without flinching. "The sheriff received word from a cattle driver this morning," she said quickly. "There's a back entrance to this mine. It comes out about a quarter-mile south, hidden in a stand of juniper trees." Samuel stared at her, processing this critical information. "And you couldn't have sent a rider to tell me this?" "There wasn't anyone to send," she replied. "The men who could ride were all out with a posse handling another matter near the eastern border. I volunteered. And I wasn't about to let her come alone," Tate added. Samuel shook his head in disbelief. "You should have waited." "If we had waited, you might have been killed," Penelope said firmly. "Now, are you going to use this information or continue lecturing us about bringing it to you?" Despite the dire situation, Samuel felt an unexpected urge to laugh at her spirit. Instead, he turned to Tate. "How many men did Decker have when you got word of them?" 7, Tate confirmed, "all experienced gunmen." "I've taken out 4, Samuel said. "That leaves Decker and 2 others inside." Tate nodded. "What's your plan?" Samuel glanced at Penelope, who was watching him with those perceptive green eyes. "You stay here with Miss Warren. Keep her safe and provide covering fire if needed. I'll circle around to this back entrance." "And then?" Penelope asked. "And then I finish what I came to do," Samuel replied, his voice hardening. Tate handed him a stick of dynamite and matches from his saddlebag. "Brought this along. Thought it might be useful if they were holed up." Samuel nodded his thanks and turned to go, but Penelope caught his arm. Her touch was light, but it seemed to burn through the fabric of his coat. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly. "Samuel, please be careful." The use of his given name startled him almost as much as her concern. He found himself unable to form a suitably detached response. "I will," he said simply. And then he was gone, moving through the lengthening shadows toward the southern end of the ridge. The back entrance to the mine was exactly where Penelope had described it, a narrow opening partially concealed by juniper trees, easily missed if one didn't know where to look. Samuel approached cautiously, listening for any sound that might indicate Decker had stationed a man at this exit. Hearing nothing, he lit the fuse on the dynamite, tossed it a short distance into the tunnel, and retreated behind a large boulder. The explosion shook the ground, and dust billowed from both entrances to the mine. Samuel waited only seconds before advancing into the tunnel, Winchester ready. The passageway was narrow and dark, the air thick with dust from the explosion. Samuel moved carefully, his senses heightened. He had gone perhaps 50 yards when he heard coughing ahead someone struggling to breathe in the dust-filled air. He rounded a bend in the tunnel to find one of Decker's men on his knees, disoriented from the blast. The man reached for his gun, but Samuel was faster. A single shot echoed in the confined space, and the outlaw slumped to the ground. Further in, Samuel encountered the main chamber of the mine. Light filtered in from the main entrance, and he could make out the shape of a man lying motionless on the ground, apparently killed or seriously injured by the explosion. Of Decker himself, there was no sign. Samuel moved cautiously across the chamber, checking behind stacked crates and barrels. The gang had been living here for some time, judging by the bedrolls, cooking equipment, and supplies stacked against one wall. A noise from the direction of the main entrance caught his attention. Samuel turned, rifle raised, just as Ezra Decker emerged from a side passage, revolver in hand. "Blackwood," Decker spat, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "Should have known they'd send you." "It's over, Decker," Samuel replied evenly. "Put down the gun," Decker laughed, a harsh sound in the dusty air. "So you can take me back for hanging? I don't think so." "Your choice," Samuel said, his finger steady on the trigger. For a moment, it seemed Decker might surrender. Then his eyes flickered to something behind Samuel, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Got company, Blackwood," he said. Samuel didn't fall for the distraction. "Nice try." "No trick," Decker insisted, his smile widening. "Pretty lady and the sheriff. Guess they got worried about you." A cold fear gripped Samuel's chest. He didn't dare turn to look, knowing Decker would shoot the instant he did. But if Penelope and Tate had indeed followed him into the mine, they were in grave danger. "Samuel," Penelope's voice came from behind him, confirming his worst fear. In that split second of distraction, Decker made his move, raising his revolver and firing. Samuel felt the bullet tear through his left side, the impact spinning him half around. Still, his training and instincts took over. As he fell, he brought the Winchester up and fired. Decker staggered backward, clutching his chest, a look of surprise on his face. He fired again, wildly, the bullet striking the rock wall as he collapsed to his knees. Samuel's second shot caught him in the throat, and the outlaw leader fell face forward onto the dusty floor of the mine. "Samuel." Penelope's cry seemed to come from very far away as darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. He was vaguely aware of her kneeling beside him, of her hands pressing against the wound in his side. "Foolish woman," he managed to say, though there was no anger in his voice. "Told you to stay put." "When have I given you any indication that I'm the type to follow orders?" she replied, her voice strained but determined. "Sheriff, help me. We need to get him out of here." Samuel wanted to tell her it wasn't necessary, that he'd survived worse, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself studying her face as she worked to staunch his bleeding, the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the tenderness in her touch, despite the urgency of her actions. It was the last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away. Samuel awoke to the sensation of soft sheets against his skin and the smell of lavender. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept in a proper bed. Then the pain in his side brought reality crashing back, along with the memory of the mine, Decker, and Penelope's face hovering over him as darkness claimed him. He opened his eyes to find himself in a small bedroom, sunlight filtering through lace curtains. It took him a moment to recognize it as his room at the Preston boarding house. He attempted to sit up, only to have firm hands press him gently back onto the pillows. "I wouldn't try that just yet, Mr. Blackwood," came Martha Preston's voice. "That bullet took a fair piece of you with it." Samuel turned his head to see the older woman sitting in a chair beside the bed, knitting needles clicking in her hands. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. 3 days, she replied, setting her knitting aside and reaching for a glass of water on the bedside table. "Here, drink this. Doctor said you'd be mighty thirsty when you woke up." Samuel accepted the water gratefully, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. As his mind cleared, questions formed. "Decker?" "Dead, along with all his men," Mrs. Preston confirmed. "Sheriff Tate says you did this town a great service. The council's vote to pay you the agreed-upon sum was unanimous." Samuel nodded slightly, then asked the question that pressed most urgently on his mind. "Miss Warren?" A knowing look crossed Mrs. Preston's face. "Penelope hasn't left your side for more than a few minutes at a time since they brought you back. I finally insisted she get some proper rest this morning." She paused, studying him. "She saved your life, you know. Dr. Graves said if she hadn't stopped the bleeding when she did, You'd have bled out before they got you to town. This information settled uncomfortably in Samuel's chest. He wasn't accustomed to owing his life to anyone, let alone a woman he barely knew. She shouldn't have been there at all, he muttered. No, she shouldn't have, Mrs. Preston agreed unexpectedly. But my niece has always had a stubborn streak wider than the Mississippi. Once she sets her mind to something, there's no changing it. She rose from her chair. I'll let her know you're awake. She'll want to see for herself. Before Samuel could protest, Mrs. Preston had left the room. He lay back against the pillows, taking stock of his condition. The wound in his side throbbed dully, but the sharp pain he would associate with infection was absent. Someone had dressed him in a clean nightshirt, an intimacy that made him uncomfortable to consider. He was still processing this when the door opened again, and Penelope entered, carrying a tray. She looked tired, with shadows under her eyes, but a smile brightened her face when she saw him awake. You're back among the living, she said, setting the tray on a small table. How do you feel? Like I've been shot, Samuel replied dryly. A surprised laugh escaped her. Well, your sense of humor seems intact, which I take as a good sign. She moved to the bedside, her expression growing more serious. You lost a lot of blood. The doctor wasn't certain you'd pull through the first night. Samuel studied her face, noting the genuine concern in her eyes. Why did you follow me into the mine? He asked directly. Penelope sat in the chair her aunt had vacated, smoothing her skirts with a gesture that seemed more nervous than practical. Sheriff Tate heard gunfire, then the explosion. He was worried you might need assistance. She paused. I insisted on accompanying him. It was a foolish risk, Samuel said, though without the heat he might have expected to feel. Decker could have killed you. He nearly killed you, she countered, and if we hadn't been there, he might have succeeded. Her green eyes held his steadily. Do you always have such difficulty accepting help, Mr. Blackwood? Samuel, he corrected automatically, surprising himself. And yes, I do. Help usually comes with strings attached. Not all help, she said softly. Sometimes people assist others simply because it's the right thing to do. Samuel looked away, uncomfortable with both her direct gaze and the conversation. The sheriff said something about another matter requiring a posse. What happened? Penelope allowed the change of subject. Cattle rustlers on the eastern range. Nothing as serious as Decker's gang, but it required attention. That's why Sheriff Tate was the only lawman available when I received the information about the mine's second entrance. How did you come by that information? Samuel asked, genuinely curious. A cattle driver stopped at the general store, she explained. He overheard me asking Mr. Henderson if he'd heard anything about the abandoned mine where the outlaws were hiding. The driver mentioned he'd once worked a claim in those hills and knew the old shafts well. When he described the back entrance, I knew immediately I had to get the information to you. Samuel nodded slowly. You may have saved my life with that information, though you nearly got yourself killed delivering it. A small smile touched her lips. Then I suppose we're even. Before Samuel could respond, the door opened again, and Dr. Graves entered a tall, thin man with spectacles and a serious demeanor. Ah, Mr. Blackwood. Good to see you conscious, he said, approaching the bed. Miss Warren, if you wouldn't mind stepping out while I examine the patient. Penelope rose gracefully. Of course, doctor. I'll return later, Samuel. As she left, Samuel found himself watching her departure with an unfamiliar feeling in his chest, something akin to regret at seeing her go. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced in many years, and it unsettled him almost as much as the bullet wound in his side. The next 2 weeks passed in a frustrating haze of enforced inactivity for Samuel. Dr. Graves insisted he remain bedridden for the first week, then allowed only limited movement for the second. The wound was healing well, but the substantial blood loss had weakened him more than Samuel cared to admit. Throughout his recovery, Penelope was a constant presence. She brought him meals, read to him from books she'd borrowed from Mr. Finch's collection, and engaged him in conversation that gradually drew him out of his habitual taciturnity. At first, Samuel had been uncomfortable with her attention, viewing it as an obligation she felt due to her involvement in his injury. But as days passed, he began to look forward to her visits, to the sound of her voice and the fresh perspective she brought to discussions of everything from literature to politics. "You're remarkably well-read for a bounty hunter," she observed one afternoon as they discussed a volume of Emerson's essays. "My father was a schoolteacher," Samuel replied, surprising himself with the personal disclosure. "Education was non-negotiable in our home, even after we moved west to Kansas Territory when I was 10. Penelope seemed delighted by this revelation. "That explains much about you. There's always been a thoughtfulness behind your eyes that belies your chosen profession." Samuel shifted uncomfortably under her perceptive gaze. "Reading doesn't make a man good, Miss Warren, just potentially more dangerous." "Penelope," she corrected, echoing his own earlier correction. "And I disagree. Education opens minds to possibilities beyond one's immediate circumstances. It's why I taught at a school for girls in Philadelphia before coming west." This was new information, and Samuel found himself genuinely interested. "You were a teacher," she nodded, a shadow crossing her face. "Until the school's board of directors decided a woman with my outspoken tendencies was not an appropriate influence on young ladies who should be focused on securing advantageous marriages." "Their loss," Samuel commented, earning a surprised smile from Penelope. "That's possibly the kindest thing anyone has said about my dismissal," she said. "Most of Philadelphia society seemed to think it was long overdue." Samuel studied her face, seeing the hurt beneath her composed exterior. "Why did you really come west, Penelope?" "It wasn't just to visit your aunt, was it?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the pattern on the book cover in her lap. "No," she admitted finally. "I came because I had nowhere else to go. My parents died last winter influenza." "The house went to my brother, who is married to a woman who made it clear I was not welcome as a permanent resident, with no position at the school and limited funds of my own." She shrugged. Aunt Martha's invitation seemed providential. "I'm sorry about your parents," Samuel said, the words inadequate but sincere. Penelope looked up, meeting his eyes. "Thank you. And what of your family, Samuel? You mentioned your father was a teacher, but you speak of him in the past tense." Samuel rarely discussed his past, but something about Penelope's direct question and genuine interest made the words come easier than expected. "Both my parents died before the war fever took them within a month of each other. I was 17, joined the Union Army 2 years later." "And after the war," she prompted gently, Samuel's expression hardened involuntarily. "I had a wife, Marie. We married young just before I enlisted. She was killed by raiders while I was away fighting." Penelope's face softened with genuine sympathy. "Oh, Samuel, I'm so sorry." "It was a long time ago," he said, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. "Time doesn't always heal such wounds," she observed quietly. "Sometimes it just teaches us to carry them more efficiently." The insight struck Samuel with unexpected force. She had articulated exactly what he had never been able to express. He hadn't healed from Marie's death. He had simply learned to function despite it. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Preston calling Penelope to help with dinner preparations. As she rose to leave, Penelope hesitated by the bedside, then impulsively reached out to squeeze Samuel's hand. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she said softly. "I know it wasn't easy." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving Samuel to contemplate the unfamiliar warmth her touch had left behind. By the end of the 3rd week, Samuel was able to move about with only minimal discomfort. Dr. Graves pronounced him well enough to resume light activities, though strenuous exertion was still prohibited. Samuel found himself in the strange position of having nowhere pressing to go and no immediate job requiring his attention. The $500 from the town council for eliminating Decker's gang provided a comfortable cushion, allowing him the luxury of a genuine convalescence. It was an unfamiliar sensation for a man accustomed to constant movement, always tracking the next bounty, the next job. More unsettling was his growing awareness of Penelope's effect on him. Their daily conversations had evolved into something he found himself anticipating with an eagerness that both confused and alarmed him. She challenged his long-held beliefs, made him reconsider perspectives he'd dismissed years ago, and worst of all, she made him laugh, something he'd nearly forgotten how to do. One crisp November afternoon, nearly a month after the confrontation with Decker, Samuel sat on the boarding house porch, watching as Penelope tended to her aunt's small garden, preparing it for the coming winter. The sight of her kneeling in the dirt, her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of soil on her cheek, stirred something in him he'd thought long dead. "You're staring, Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Preston commented as she joined him on the porch, her knitting basket in hand. Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "Just getting some air." The older woman made a noncommittal sound as she settled into a rocking chair and began working on what appeared to be a scarf. "My niece is quite fond of you," she said after a moment, her eyes on her work. Samuel didn't know how to respond to such a direct statement. "Penelope doesn't give her affection easily," Mrs. Preston continued when he remained silent. "She guards her heart carefully. Too many disappointments, I suspect." "Mrs. Preston," Samuel began, uncertain of what he wanted to say. She looked up from her knitting, her gaze direct. "You're a man with ghosts, Mr. Blackwood. I recognize the look. My late husband had the same shadows in his eyes when he returned from the Mexican War." She paused. "He found peace eventually. It's possible for even the most haunted souls to find their way back to the light." Before Samuel could respond, Penelope approached the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "What are you two discussing so seriously?" she asked, her cheeks flushed from exertion and the cool air. "Just observing that winter will be upon us soon, Mrs." Preston replied smoothly, returning to her knitting. "Mr. Blackwood will need to decide whether to continue his travels or wait for the spring thaw." The question hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Samuel had never stayed in one place for more than a few weeks since Marie's death. The idea of wintering in Cottonwood Springs should have filled him with restlessness. Instead, he found himself considering it with unexpected seriousness. "I have some business in Cheyenne," he said finally, "but it could wait until spring." Penelope's smile at his words was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, sudden, brilliant, and warming. "Then you'll stay through winter?" Samuel found himself nodding, the decision making itself in response to her evident pleasure. "If Mrs. Preston has no objection to a long-term boarder." "None whatsoever," the older woman assured him, a knowing look in her eyes as she glanced between them. "In fact, we could use a strong pair of hands around here. The woodshed needs restocking, and there are repairs I've been putting off." "Consider it done," Samuel replied, surprising himself with how easily he accepted the domestic responsibilities. That evening, after dinner, Penelope suggested a walk through town despite the chill in the air. Samuel agreed, curious about her purpose. They strolled in comfortable silence for a time, their breath forming small clouds in the cold evening air. "You don't have business in Cheyenne, do you?" Penelope asked suddenly, glancing at him with a knowing look. Samuel had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Not pressing business." She laughed softly. "You're a terrible liar, Samuel Blackwood." "Not usually," he admitted. "I've just never had much practice lying to people I respect." The words hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Penelope stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Why are you staying, Samuel?" she asked directly. "The real reason." He could have deflected, could have mentioned the approaching winter or his still healing wound, but looking into her clear green eyes, Samuel found himself unwilling to offer anything but truth. "Because the thought of riding away from here from you feels wrong in a way I can't quite explain," he said quietly. Penelope's expression softened, vulnerability replacing her usual confidence. "I've grown very fond of you, Samuel." More than I should, perhaps, given how little we truly know each other. I think you know me better than anyone has in a very long time, he replied, the admission costing him more than she could know. She reached out, gently touching his arm. There's a town social next week. Would you accompany me? The request was simple, but its implications were profound. Attending a social event together would announce to the entire community that there was something between them, something beyond the connection of rescuer and rescued. People will talk, Samuel warned, though he found himself caring less about that prospect than he would have expected. People always talk, Penelope replied with a small smile. I stopped letting that dictate my choices long ago. Samuel considered for a moment, then nodded. I'd be honored to accompany you, Miss Warren. Her smile widened. I believe we're well past Miss Warren at this point, don't you? As they continued their walk through the quiet streets of Cottonwood Springs, Samuel felt something shifting within him like ice breaking up on a river after a long, hard winter. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The town social was held in the newly constructed schoolhouse, a simple but sturdy building that served as both educational facility and community gathering place. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the decorated interior. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while a small group of musicians played lively tunes in the corner. Samuel felt distinctly out of place among the townspeople in their Sunday best. He had purchased a new shirt and string tie for the occasion, but he still carried himself with the alertness of a man accustomed to watching for threats rather than socializing. Penelope, by contrast, seemed to bloom in the social atmosphere. She wore a dress of deep burgundy that complemented her auburn hair, which she had arranged in an elegant style with a few curls framing her face. She moved easily among the townsfolk, introducing Samuel to those he hadn't yet met during his time in Cottonwood Springs. You look uncomfortable, she observed quietly as they stood near the refreshment table. We can leave if you wish. Samuel shook his head. I'm fine, just not used to such gatherings. When was the last time you attended a social event? She asked curiously. He had to think back. A wedding in a mining camp near Denver, maybe 4 years ago. Before that, he hesitated. My own wedding, I suppose. It was a small affair at my parents' home. Penelope's expression softened at this rare mention of his past. Thank you for coming tonight. I know this isn't easy for you. Before Samuel could respond, Sheriff Tate approached, nodding respectfully to them both. Blackwood, Miss Warren. Good to see you out and about. Sheriff, Samuel acknowledged. Any trouble since Decker? Tate shook his head. Quietest month we've had all year. Word's gotten around about what happened to Decker's gang. Seems the less savory elements are giving Cottonwood Springs a wide berth. That's good news, Penelope said with a smile. Indeed it is, Tate agreed, then hesitated before continuing. Actually, Blackwood, I wanted to speak with you about something. The town council's been discussing the need for a deputy. With the settlement growing and more homesteaders arriving each month, I could use a reliable man to help keep the peace. Samuel stared at him, taken aback by the unexpected offer. You're offering me a job as a lawman? Tate nodded. Salary's not much, $60 a month plus room and board if you want it, but it's steady work, and you've already proven yourself to the town. Samuel glanced at Penelope, whose expression revealed nothing of her thoughts on the matter. I appreciate the offer, Sheriff. Let me think on it. Of course, Tate replied, tipping his hat to Penelope. Enjoy the evening, folks. As the sheriff moved away, Penelope turned to Samuel. A deputy sheriff, she mused. That would be quite a change from bounty hunting. It would, Samuel agreed, still processing the idea. Not sure I'm cut out for enforcing laws rather than just tracking those who break them. I think you'd make an excellent deputy, Penelope said thoughtfully. You have a strong sense of justice, and the people here respect you. Samuel wasn't as certain. His life had been defined by solitude and the freedom to move on whenever a place became too familiar, too comfortable. Taking a position as deputy would mean committing to Cottonwood Springs, in a way he hadn't committed to any place since before the war. The musicians struck up a waltz, and couples began moving to the center of the room. "Would you dance with me, Samuel?" Penelope asked, her eyes bright in the lantern light. He hesitated. "It's been a long time since I danced." "Some things you don't forget," she said, holding out her hand. "Please." Unable to deny her, Samuel took her hand and led her to the dance floor. As they began to move to the music, he was surprised to find that she was right. His body remembered the steps, even if his mind had forgotten. They moved together with unexpected harmony, her hand warm in his, her other resting lightly on his shoulder. "You dance very well for a man who claims to be out of practice," Penelope observed, looking up at him with a smile that made his heart quicken. "I have an excellent partner," he replied, the compliment coming more naturally than he would have expected. As they continued to dance, Samuel became increasingly aware of the curious glances from other townspeople. Some were approving, others speculative, but all confirmed what he already knew. His presence at Penelope's side made a statement neither of them could take back. The realization should have alarmed him. Instead, he found himself tightening his hold on her waist slightly, drawing her a fraction closer as they moved across the floor. Penelope's eyes widened briefly in surprise before her smile deepened, a flush rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the exertion of dancing. Later that evening, as they walked back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars, Samuel found himself reluctant for the night to end. They moved slowly, Penelope's arm linked through his, their conversation flowing easily between topics both serious and light. "Have you thought about Sheriff Tate's offer?" she asked as they approached the boarding house. Samuel nodded slowly. "I have. It's tempting in ways I didn't expect." "But," she prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice. He stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. "But taking that position would mean staying here indefinitely, making a life here." He paused. "That's not something I've considered possible for a very long time." Penelope studied his face, her expression thoughtful. "What changed?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning neither had fully articulated. Samuel knew the answer. She had changed everything. Her intelligence, her courage, her willingness to see beyond the hardened exterior he presented to the world, all of it had begun to thaw something he'd thought permanently frozen. "You know what changed?" he said quietly. Penelope's breath caught audibly. "Samuel, I don't have the right to ask anything of you," he continued before she could speak. "My life has been complicated, violent. I've done things I'm not proud of, made choices that have left their mark. I'm not the kind of man someone like you should." "Stop," she interrupted, placing her fingers gently against his lips. "You don't get to decide what kind of man I should care for, Samuel Blackwood." When she removed her fingers, Samuel caught her hand in his, holding it against his chest. "Penelope, I haven't allowed myself to feel anything like this in 12 years. I'm not sure I remember how." Her eyes softened. "Perhaps it's like dancing," she suggested. "Some things the heart doesn't forget, even when the mind tries to." Samuel found himself drawing her closer, his free hand moving to the small of her back. "If I take this deputy position, if I stay in Cottonwood Springs," he began, then hesitated. "Yes," she prompted softly. "Would you consider a future that included me?" He asked, the words coming out rougher than he intended, emotion making his voice unsteady. In answer, Penelope rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief, tender, and it shattered the last of Samuel's resistance. When she pulled back, he followed, capturing her lips again in a deeper kiss that spoke of years of loneliness and the unexpected hope of something more. When they finally parted, Penelope's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Does that answer your question?" she whispered. Samuel nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. Instead, he drew her close, holding her against his chest as the stars wheeled overhead and the future suddenly full of possibilities he had long denied himself stretched out before them. The following morning, Samuel walked to the sheriff's office, his decision made. Tate looked up from his desk as Samuel entered, a knowing expression crossing his weathered features. "Morning, Blackwood," he greeted. "Something on your mind?" "I'll take the deputy position," Samuel said without preamble. "When do I start?" Tate grinned, standing to offer his hand. "How about right now? Got a stack of wanted posters needs sorting, and I could use help checking on those new homesteaders who just arrived from Ohio." As Samuel shook the sheriff's hand, he felt a strange sense of rightness settle over him. This wasn't the life he had envisioned for himself after Marie's death. He hadn't envisioned any life at all beyond the next bounty, the next trail. But something about Cottonwood Springs, and more specifically about Penelope Warren, had changed his perspective in ways he was only beginning to understand. Winter descended on Cottonwood Springs with a series of heavy snowfalls that transformed the landscape into a pristine expanse of white. Samuel settled into his role as deputy with surprising ease, finding satisfaction in preventing trouble rather than merely responding to it after the fact. His reputation alone deterred many potential troublemakers, and his fair but firm handling of the occasional disturbance earned him the respect of the townspeople. His relationship with Penelope deepened as the cold months passed. They spent evenings reading by the fire in the boarding house parlor, took walks when the weather permitted, and gradually, Samuel shared more of his past with her, the good and the bad, the moments of honor and the decisions he regretted. To his continual amazement, she accepted all of it with the same clear-eyed understanding, neither judging nor dismissing his experiences. In turn, she told him of her life in Philadelphia, her struggles to be taken seriously as an educator, her refusal to accept the limited options society deemed appropriate for women of her class, and her grief at losing both parents in quick succession. "Do you miss the city?" Samuel asked one snowy evening as they sat before the fire, Penelope working on a piece of embroidery while he cleaned his revolver, a habit he maintained despite the relative peacefulness of his current duties. She considered the question thoughtfully. "I miss certain aspects, the libraries, the museums, the lectures at the university that I would occasionally sneak into." She smiled at his raised eyebrow. Women weren't officially permitted to attend, but several professors turned a blind eye if one sat quietly at the back. "Why doesn't that surprise me?" Samuel commented with a small smile of his own. "But no," she continued, "I don't miss the constraints, the endless social obligations, the constant awareness of falling short of expectations." She set aside her embroidery. "Here I feel free. Even with the physical hardships of frontier life, there's a liberty to define oneself that doesn't exist back east." Samuel nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "The West has always been a place for reinvention." "Is that what you're doing, Samuel?" she asked perceptively. "Reinventing yourself." He considered this as he reassembled his cleaned revolver with practiced ease. "Not reinventing," he said finally. "Rediscovering, perhaps, parts of myself I thought were gone for good." Penelope's smile was worth every moment of vulnerability the admission cost him. She rose from her chair and moved to sit beside him on the small sofa, taking his hand in hers. "I'm glad," she said simply. As Christmas approached, the town prepared for its annual celebration. Despite the harsh winter conditions, spirits were high in Cottonwood Springs. The general store displayed imported candies and small toys for children. The ladies of the church organized a program of carols and readings, and even the saloon was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. Samuel, who had not celebrated Christmas in any meaningful way since before the war, found himself caught up in the preparations despite his initial reluctance. When Sheriff Tate mentioned needing someone to play Santa Claus for the town's children, Samuel quickly volunteered Deputy Hobbs for the duty, earning a laugh from Penelope and a relieved nod from the portly deputy, who was indeed better suited to the role physically. On Christmas Eve, Samuel and Penelope attended the service at the small white church on the edge of town. The building was packed with nearly every resident of Cottonwood Springs, the atmosphere warm and festive despite the bitter cold outside. Candles flickered in the windows, and the smell of pine filled the air from the freshly cut trees decorating the sanctuary. As the congregation sang, "Silent Night," Samuel found himself watching Penelope's profile in the candlelight. She sang with genuine joy, her voice clear and sweet among the others. The sight of her, this remarkable woman who had somehow broken through the barriers he'd spent years constructing around his heart, filled him with an emotion so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. When the service concluded, they stepped out into a night of perfect stillness, the stars brilliant in the clear sky above. Fresh snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked arm in arm toward the boarding house. "Penelope," Samuel said suddenly, drawing her to a stop beneath the bare branches of an old oak tree, its limbs outlined in silver by the moonlight on snow. "Yes," she asked, turning to face him, her breath visible in the cold air. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small box. "I have something for you, a Christmas gift." Penelope's eyes widened in surprise. "Samuel, you didn't need to, I wanted to," he interrupted gently, pressing the box into her gloved hands. "Please." She carefully removed her gloves and opened the box, gasping softly at what lay inside. A delicate gold locket gleamed against the velvet lining, its surface engraved with an intricate pattern of leaves and flowers. "It's beautiful," she whispered, looking up at him with shining eyes. "Open it," Samuel urged softly. With careful fingers, Penelope unlatched the locket. Inside was a small piece of paper with a single line written in Samuel's steady hand. "Will you marry me?" Her eyes flew to his face, disbelief and joy warring in her expression. "Samuel," he took her hands in his, the open locket nestled between their palms. "I never thought I'd ask this question again," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Never thought I'd want to. But you've changed everything, Penelope. You've shown me that the heart can heal, that there can be life after loss." He paused, searching for the right words. "I love you. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears spilled onto Penelope's cheeks, catching the moonlight like diamonds. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Samuel, I'll marry you." He pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that sealed their promise. The locket pressed between them, a small, hard reminder of the pledge they had just made to each other. When they finally parted, Penelope laughed softly, the sound like music in the quiet night. "What will people say? The stern deputy and the outspoken Eastern lady." "They'll say we're well matched," Samuel replied, smiling as he brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Two stubborn souls who found each other against all odds. Penelope's answering smile was radiant. "I love you, Samuel Blackwood. Even when I shouldn't have, even when it seemed impossible, I've loved you since you rode into Cottonwood Springs with dust on your coat and shadows in your eyes." As they walked the remaining distance to the boarding house, Samuel felt a sense of peace he had not known in 12 long years. The path ahead would not be without challenges, he had no illusions about that. But for the first time since losing Marie, he found himself looking toward the future with hope, rather than resignation. They were married on a clear, cold day in February 1877, in the same church where they had attended Christmas Eve services. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the small sanctuary overflowing with well-wishers. Penelope wore a dress of ivory silk that her aunt had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once adorned her mother's wedding gown. Samuel, uncomfortable but dignified in a new black suit, waited for her at the altar with Sheriff Tate standing as his best man. When Penelope appeared at the church door on Mr. Finch's arm, the elderly gentleman having volunteered to give her away in the absence of her father or brother, Samuel felt his breath catch. She was radiant, her auburn hair crowned with a circlet of winter berries and evergreen, her cheeks flushed with happiness. As she walked toward him, Samuel remembered the night they had met, how she had opened the door of the boarding house and momentarily caught him off guard with her beauty and directness. How fitting that she should still have the power to leave him speechless, even now. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, though Samuel had insisted on adding a promise of his own. "I will protect you, respect you, and cherish you all the days of my life." When he slipped his mother's gold band onto Penelope's finger, his hands were steady, but his voice trembled slightly with the depth of his emotion. The celebration afterward was held at the town hall, with tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by nearly every household in Cottonwood Springs. There was music and dancing, speeches and toasts, and through it all, Samuel found himself continually seeking out his wife's face in the crowd, still somewhat amazed that this extraordinary woman had chosen to share her life with him. Later that night, alone in the small house, they had purchased at the edge of town a modest structure with 2 bedrooms, a cozy parlor, and a kitchen with a view of the mountains. Samuel took Penelope in his arms, overwhelmed by the gift of this second chance at happiness. "What are you thinking?" she asked, reaching up to touch his face gently. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," he replied honestly, "and that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." Penelope's eyes softened. "You already do," she whispered, drawing his head down for a kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future filled with possibilities neither had dared to imagine before finding each other. Spring came to Cottonwood Springs in a rush of melting snow and returning birdsong. The creek that gave the town its name swelled with runoff from the mountains, and the cottonwood trees sprouted fresh green leaves that rustled in the warming breezes. Samuel and Penelope settled into married life with a contentment that surprised them both. Their home, though small, became a haven, a place where Samuel could finally lay down the vigilance that had defined his existence for so long, and where Penelope found the acceptance and partnership she had always sought. As deputy sheriff, Samuel continued to help maintain peace in the growing settlement. His reputation ensured that most trouble was handled before it began. Though the spring cattle drives occasionally brought rowdy cowboys to town who needed reminding of local ordinances against discharging firearms within city limits or riding horses on the boardwalks. Penelope, meanwhile, had approached the town council about establishing a proper school. The current arrangement classes held irregularly by the minister's wife for younger children was inadequate for the growing population. With her experience as a teacher and her persuasive arguments about the importance of education for the town's future, the council had agreed to hire her as Cottonwood Springs' first schoolteacher. "Are you sure about this?" Samuel asked one evening as they sat on their small front porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of pink and gold. "Teaching was what got you into trouble back east," Penelope smiled, reaching over to take his hand. "That was different. In Philadelphia, I was expected to prepare young ladies for a very specific role in society, one I didn't particularly believe in myself. Here, I'll be teaching children to read, write, think for themselves. Boys and girls together, with no artificial limitations on what they might become." Her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "That's a purpose I can dedicate myself to wholeheartedly." Samuel squeezed her hand, once again struck by the strength of her convictions. "The children of Cottonwood Springs won't know how fortunate they are to have you as their teacher." "I think they will," she replied confidently. "Children are remarkably perceptive about who truly cares for their welfare." She paused, a slight hesitation in her expression before continuing. "Speaking of children," something in her tone made Samuel turn to look at her more closely. "Yes." Penelope met his gaze, a mixture of joy and nervousness in her eyes. "I believe we may be welcoming one of our own before the year is out." For a moment, Samuel could only stare at her, processing her words. "You're with child?" he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, watching his reaction carefully. "Dr. Graves confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to be sure before I told you." A surge of emotions swept through Samuel: joy, fear, wonder, and an overwhelming sense of protectiveness. A baby, he said, as if testing the reality of the word. Our baby. Penelope's expression softened with relief at the happiness evident in his voice. Are you pleased? In answer, Samuel drew her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that conveyed what words could not. More than pleased, he murmured against her hair. Grateful, terrified, overjoyed. She laughed softly, relaxing against him. That's a fair assessment of my own feelings as well. As they sat together in the gathering twilight, Samuel found himself contemplating the extraordinary turn his life had taken. A year ago, he had been a solitary figure riding the harsh landscapes of the West, his heart as barren as the badlands he often traversed. Now he was a husband, soon to be a father, with roots sinking deep into the community of Cottonwood Springs. The transformation seemed almost miraculous, yet it had happened so gradually that he had hardly noticed the changes until they were complete. Like the spring thaw that had transformed the frozen creek into a vigorous, life-giving force, Penelope's love had melted the ice around his heart, allowing life to flow once more. That night, as Penelope slept beside him, Samuel lay awake, one hand resting protectively over the place where their child grew. He made silent promises to both his wife and their unborn baby, promises of protection, of presence, of a love that would never waver no matter what challenges life might bring. The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Samuel added a nursery to their home, carefully crafting a cradle from pine harvested from the nearby hills. Penelope began the school term, but arranged for Mrs. Finch to take over her duties when the time came for the baby's arrival. As summer gave way to autumn, Penelope's condition became more pronounced. Samuel found himself increasingly protective, checking on her between his rounds as deputy and insisting she rest more frequently than she deemed necessary. I'm pregnant, not ill, she reminded him with fond exasperation one afternoon when he returned home to find her rearranging the parlor furniture. Women have been bearing children since the beginning of time. Not my child, Samuel replied stubbornly, taking the heavy footstool from her hands. And not my wife. Penelope's expression softened at the concern evident in his face. Very well, she conceded, allowing him to guide her to a chair. But only because you look so worried. The baby and I are perfectly fine, Samuel. He knelt beside her chair, placing a gentle hand on the swell of her abdomen. I can't help worrying about you both. You're everything to me. Penelope covered his hand with her own, her eyes bright with emotion. And you are everything to us. As if in agreement, the baby chose that moment to kick against Samuel's palm. His eyes widened in wonder at the strong movement. That was quite a kick, he observed. Perhaps we're raising a future deputy. Or a teacher, Penelope countered with a smile. Or a doctor, or an explorer, or anything else they might wish to become. Samuel nodded, marveling at the possibility that lay before them, the chance to raise a child free from the constraints and hardships that had shaped his own life. Whatever they choose to be, he said solemnly, they will know they are loved. That I promise. Their daughter, Sarah Marie Blackwood, was born on a clear October night in 1877, her lusty cries announcing her arrival to the world with unmistakable vigor. Doctor. Graves pronounced her perfectly healthy, with a full head of dark hair and what he termed a determined expression that made both parents laugh with recognition. Samuel, who had paced anxiously outside the bedroom during Penelope's labor, felt his heart expand with an entirely new kind of love as he held his daughter for the first time. She was so small, so perfect, her tiny hand curling reflexively around his finger with surprising strength. She has your eyes, Penelope observed tiredly from the bed, her face pale but radiant with joy. And your stubbornness, I think. She certainly wasn't in any hurry to make her entrance. Samuel smiled, carefully returning the baby to her mother's arms. But she has your spirit, he countered, sitting on the edge of the bed and wrapping an arm around Penelope's shoulders. Look at her, not even an hour old and already surveying her domain. Indeed, little Sarah seemed unusually alert, her dark blue eyes moving from her mother's face to her father's with an expression that might almost be described as contemplative. "Sarah Marie," Penelope murmured, tracing a gentle finger along the baby's cheek. "For your mother and mine." Samuel nodded, his throat tight with emotion. They would be proud to share their names with her. As the first light of dawn filtered through the bedroom window, Samuel found himself overcome with gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought him to this moment, the telegram from Sheriff Tate that had led him to Cottonwood Springs, Penelope's decision to come west, even the bullet from Decker's gun that had kept him in town long enough to recognize what he had found in this remarkable woman. "What are you thinking?" Penelope asked softly, recognizing the reflective expression on his face. "That the path that led me here was long and often dark," he replied honestly. "But every step was worth it to arrive at this moment with you and Sarah." Penelope's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "I feel the same," she whispered, "as if everything in my life was leading me to us." Samuel leaned down to kiss her gently, then pressed his lips to his daughter's forehead. In that moment, the last vestiges of the hardened bounty hunter who had sworn never to love again dissolved completely, replaced by a husband and father who understood that the greatest strength lay not in isolation, but in the courage to open one's heart to love despite all its risks. 5 years passed, bringing changes both to the Blackwood family and to Cottonwood Springs itself. The town had grown considerably, with a railway spur line connecting it to the main transcontinental route and bringing new residents, businesses, and opportunities. Samuel had been promoted to sheriff after Tate retired, a position he filled with the same quiet competence he brought to everything he undertook. Penelope continued teaching at the school, which now occupied a proper building with 2 classrooms and a small library filled with books she had personally selected. Her progressive educational methods occasionally raised eyebrows among more traditional residents, but the results children who rayed above national standards and demonstrated exceptional critical thinking skills spoke for themselves. Sarah, now 5, was a spirited child with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes. She displayed an independence and curiosity that both challenged and delighted her parents. Already reading at an advanced level thanks to Penelope's instruction, she often accompanied Samuel on his morning rounds of the town, charming shopkeepers and learning the workings of the community from her father's patient explanations. On a warm summer evening in 1882, the Blackwood family sat on their front porch, enjoying the cooler air after a hot day. Sarah was curled in Samuel's lap, half asleep as he gently rocked the porch swing. Penelope sat nearby in a rocking chair, her hands resting on the slight swell of her abdomen, evidence of the second child they were expecting in the winter. "Papa," Sarah murmured drowsily, "tell me again how you and Mama met." Samuel exchanged an amused glance with Penelope. This had become their daughter's favorite bedtime story, though they had edited certain aspects for her young ears. The violence of the confrontation with Decker's gang was simplified, and Samuel's gunshot wound described as a minor injury. "Well," Samuel began, his deep voice rumbling soothingly beneath Sarah's ear, "I rode into Cottonwood Springs on a mission for Sheriff Tate. Your mama opened the door of Grandma Martha's boarding house, and the moment I saw her, something changed inside me." "Your papa looked very serious," Penelope added with a smile. "All dust and determination, but I saw kindness in his eyes that he tried very hard to hide." Sarah nodded sleepily. "And then the bad men shot you, and Mama saved your life." "That's right," Samuel confirmed, smoothing a hand over his daughter's dark curls. "Your Mama is very brave. She rode all the way out to the hills to bring me important information." "Even though you told her to stay behind," Sarah added, clearly relishing this familiar part of the story. Penelope laughed softly. "I've never been very good at following orders, sweetheart, especially not from stubborn men who think they need to face danger alone." Samuel's eyes met hers over their daughter's head, filled with the deep appreciation that had only grown stronger through the years of their marriage. "Thankfully," he said quietly. As Sarah finally drifted into sleep against his chest, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought him to this peaceful moment. The wounds of his past had not disappeared. He still occasionally woke from nightmares of the war, of Marie's death, of the violent encounters that had marked his years as a bounty hunter. But those shadows no longer defined him. Instead, his life was shaped by the love he shared with Penelope, the joy of raising their daughter, the satisfaction of serving a community that had become truly his own, and now the anticipation of welcoming another child into their family. The man who had once sworn never to love again had found not just love, but a richness of life he could never have imagined in his darkest days. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Penelope asked, noting his contemplative expression in the fading light. Samuel smiled, the expression coming easily now where once it had been rare. "Just counting my blessings," he replied, "and they are many." Penelope rose from her chair and moved to sit beside him on the swing, her hand finding his as they gazed out at the town that had brought them together, a place that had offered a hardened bounty hunter and an outspoken Eastern lady the chance to build a life neither had dared to dream possible. "As are mine," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky above Cottonwood Springs.